Chapter 2. The World is a Computer. The following is taken from the preface of the book, Computer Power and Human Reason, by J. Weizenbaum. A major point of this book is precisely that we, all of us, have made the world too much into a computer, and that this remaking of the world in the image of the computer started long before there were any electronic computers. Now that we have computers, it becomes somewhat easier to see this imaginative transformation we have worked on the world. Now we can use the computer itself, that is the idea of the computer, as a metaphor to help us to understand what we have done and are doing. Page 9, 1. The ancient Greeks and the Enlightenment philosopher, Immanuel Kant, were concerned to point out a major difference in the kind of reasoning we use in instrumental contexts of activity involving tools and artifacts, techné, and the categorical form of reasoning we use in knowledge contexts, episteme, whether that knowledge is practical/moral or theoretical. For Aristotle, there were three principles and four causes in relation to four kinds of change occurring in the infinite continuum of the media of change, e.g. space, time, and matter, and our understanding of the world is mediated by three kinds of science: theoretical, practical, and productive/techné. Techné, then, is best explained in terms of the reasoning we find in the productive sciences, where the major point of the activity is the creation of tools and objects that instrumentally contribute to the good-spirited flourishing life, eudaimonia, that was so important to Aristotle. The good-spirited aspect of this life, however, is best accounted for by the theoretical and practical reasoning we find in both Aristotle and Kant's writings. The major categorical difference between productive reasoning and practical/moral/theoretical reasoning is that the former is exclusively focused on the means one uses to bring about ends, rather than the ends in themselves, which we human beings and all life forms, sush, represent. The latter form of reasoning, on the other hand, i.e. reasoning about ends in themselves, exclusively obey different principles, archi, and rely less on material and efficient causation for their explanation/justification, and more on formal and final causation in such contexts. Final causation is a key here, because it is teleological in the sense Kant described in his third critique, a form belonging to forms of life. Turning to two modern philosophers of the 20th century will further enlighten us about what Weizenbaum is referring to in his preface, namely the mentality of what Hannah Arendt called the new men, whose influence over our culture began with Descartes, Hobbes, Hume, and continued with Adam Smith and Hegel, Nietzsche and Heidegger, the logical positivists, logical atomists, pragmatists, and instrumentalists. The agenda of the new men was to neutralize the influence of Aristotle and Kant upon our thinking, and replace it with a form of thinking that was anti-rationalist in spirit, a form of thinking that would restore the materialist and dualist controversies in a new form, centering round the new psychology that began in the 1870s with the definition, the science of consciousness. In Wittgenstein's early work, for example, a logical solipsism is espoused, which is abandoned later, when Wittgenstein realizes that there are fundamental conceptual confusions in much of psychology, confusions revolving around the role which forms of life and language play in the thinking and reasoning activities of the human being, whose embodiment is fundamentally different to the embodiment of artefacts such as computers. Weizenbaum continues his introductory ideas with, "We are all used to hearing that the computer is a powerful new instrument, but few people have any idea where the power of a computer comes from. The power of any artifact is a secondary power, dependent upon the primary power of its creator, and this fact means that, whilst the creator's primary powers build upon an autonomy and freedom which, the computer per definition, can never possess, the category of most importance in the account we give of the computer's secondary powers is one that necessarily places it in a material space-time continuum under the laws of cause and effect, which in turn means that the machine is essentially a reactive entity, a cog in the chain of causes and effects, in the space-time matter continuum that is continually changing. The new men of our modern age, which began with Descartes, have provided a foundation for not just confusion in the field of psychological reasoning, but a more general kind of cultural confusion, which is beginning to resemble the confusion we find in the minds of the mentally ill. We appear to have come to a time in which the ideas that there are differences between human beings and machines, that there are experiences that human beings can have but machines cannot, and that therefore, at least, There are thoughts, but not thoughts machines can have. We have come to a time in which the holding of such ideas is a lonely preoccupation, a business that tempts one to doubt of one's own sanity. In the book I wrote that the necessity to debate such ideas at all is as an index to the insanity of our time. The danger now is that the debate will stop, not because the absurdity of equating human beings with computers has finally been universally recognized, but because the voices defending human-centered positions are becoming ever fainter. p. 14.3. The general cultural confusion of the new men referred to by Arendt has infected our discourse to such an extent that one today, more often than not, fails to note that a complex artifact like a computer or a robot is not a form of life, and therefore logically cannot be said to have the power of experiencing anything. Failure to experience anything, then, has logical consequences, such as not being able to engage in any discourse related to experience, e.g. perceiving, feeling, thinking, etc. Another consequence is that one cannot legitimately engage in any reasoning about experience. This suggests that computers and their chat robots cannot mean what they say when they appear to be having a conversation about experience, i.e. they literally do not know what they are talking about. Weizenbaum also takes up the issue of the zombie-like experience that many are having in the playing of violent computer games. Experience becomes vicarious and achieved through a digital medium in which one can experience the thrill of killing, without any of the real-world experiences and consequences. The zombie, the author points out, is psychically numbed by the clinical distance there is between themselves and their victims. This is excellent training, it is argued, to detach what one is doing from the consequences of what one is doing. The rush to ensure that even 5-year-olds are introduced to this zombie experience is the rush, the author argues, to acquire an education in violence without guilt, 17. Weizenbaum points out, in the context of this discussion, that one implication of the importance of working with what he calls models is that the model only contains what is essential for the purposes for which the model is being used. Computer models, such as those we find in computer games, however, leave out almost everything that is essential to the real thing the model is modeling. This seriously truncates the learning experience, a fact, the author claims, which is not obvious to many of those involved in the computer education we are receiving. The picture that Weizenbaum paints is one of a world obsessed with techné, without its normal conceptual connections to arete, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time, dike, justice, getting what one justly deserves, and episteme, explanations and justifications that are in accordance with the principles, archie, of non-contradiction and sufficient reason. This world of techné is the world of the new men and the age of discontentment that has dawned upon us, a world without the sense of responsibility that normally flows from the life we have been leading for thousands of years before the relatively recent industrial and technological revolutions. Any discussion of collective insanity ought to refer to Freud and his later cultural writings, e.g. Civilization and its Discontents, in which Freud maintains that modern man no longer believes that all his work over the ages has been worth the effort. This essay was written in 1929 before any computers were being assembled, and at least 12 years before the first electrical non-mechanical digital machine was invented. The spirit of techné was, however, in the air, and Europe was preparing for war. The new men had succeeded in repressing the spirit of ancient Greece and the Enlightenment. In 1945, 2 weapons of mass destruction were to be dropped on civilian populations in accordance with the new spirit, which had taken root in a soil that was, by this time, almost completely toxic. Hannah Arendt is also an important commentator on the political effects of the new spirit, namely the collapse of the political party system in Europe, and their replacement by mass movements that could be easily influenced by mass messaging. These movements appealed to feelings and emotions rather than to principles and reasoning. Tyrants used this phenomenon to their advantage, and mobilized masses to do terrible deeds. We ought also, in order to retain some political perspective, remind ourselves that it was the so-called democratic USA which dropped the weapons of mass destruction on civilian populations in 1945. The action was approved of by the masses. Gallup poll 85% in favor in the US, indicating that populism and the elevation of instrumental calculation over moral judgment, in politics, was here to stay, irrespective of the political convictions of leaders. Weizenbaum points out that with the movement toward miniaturization of chips, weapon accuracy could be substantially increased. The phenomenon of using cruise missiles to destroy civilian infrastructure and target hospitals, schools, etc. had not yet occurred at the time of the writing of Weizenbaum's work, but this is now part of the current warscape of our modern world. The author also takes up the cultural influence of the mass viewing of television content, which takes as its model of knowledge a truncated form of scientific calculative thinking that bears no resemblance to the more philosophical accounts of science we find in Aristotle and Kant's writings. All other forms of so-called non-scientific knowledge is delegitimated in favor of the science of the new men. The most serious consequence of the domination of a limited conception of the law of cause and effect on the experience of men is that the agent's autonomy, or freedom, is impeached in favor of a Hobbesian mechanical deterministic view of life. The new men, it must be noted, have succeeded in the installation of their worldview, a worldview in which freedom is devalued as is the value of arete, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time, episteme, the regulation of man's activity by principles, archie, dike, the justice of getting what one deserves. These terms literally have no meaning in the lives of the new men, and the beginning of this first surfaced in a modern form in the writings of Hobbes, who saw in life, sush, the mere mechanical movement of limbs. It was Hobbes, we ought to recall, that used the model of the Leviathan, a sea monster with enormous power and dangerous for human life, to picture modern government. Sush, for Aristotle, was a term covering all forms of life from the simplest plant life that possessed the powers of growing and reproduction, to animal forms which possess these powers in addition to the power of sensing and locomotion. Human forms possess all these powers in addition to the powers of discourse and reasoning, and the relation between these powers is such that they interpenetrate and produce a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Man is the best and the worst of animals, Aristotle claims, and he also claims that he is at his best if he is a member of a good well-run state which resembles more, of course, friendly human living forms, rather than the form of a monster. The zombie is a kind of human monster that denies the essential characteristic of life, which is that, once life has ceased to exist, it is absolutely dead and so cannot be reanimated. The zombie form of life is a figment of the imagination of the new men. Our conception of ourselves, it now seems, is left to images constructed by the imagination, rather than the complex conception produced via our theoretical, practical and productive sciences and Aristotelian metaphysics, first principles. For Weizenbaum, the Hobbesian idea of a contract ensures that the freedom not to agree is substituted by a transactional process in which one freely agrees to abide by the terms of the contract. For him, it is important that both the ideas of freedom and God are respected in this transaction. This idea of a social contract, however, may well exist between men but, as Hume pointed out, has never existed between men and the states they are citizens of. The idea of a man's word is his bond is eroded with the idea of a contract that is some kind of insurance policy against the possibility of someone promising to do something and then not keeping their promise. Now, in Kantian ethics, the proposition "promises ought to be kept" is supported by the principle of the categorical imperative, and it is, of course, no guarantee that everyone will in fact keep the promises they make. If they do not keep their promises, however, their honesty and agency is called into question by moral judgments that weighed heavily on moral agents, both in ancient Greek times and in Kantian times. Nowadays, trusting each other is less prevalent, and we will believe that a third party will keep their promise only if we can prove to another third party that the promise was made. This proof, it is important to note, is only needed if the original moral system breaks down. So, what happens when the whole moral system breaks down, and we no longer trust one another because men no longer possess good wills? The only recourse left is the transactional contract, and morality becomes a matter of good defined in terms of its consequences, rather than the classical ideas of a good in itself, defined in terms of arete and dike. In the context of this discussion, it is important to point out that AI in the form of ChatGPT does not believe that promises ought to be kept is a legitimate moral recommendation with a definite meaning. Chat claims that it has learned all sorts of things, but if learning is an experience involving consciousness, then the veracity of this claim must be called into question. One can of course redefine learning mechanically in the way some early neuroscientists did when they claimed that learning is the facilitation of neuronal pathways such that a type of experience is present that was not present before. Starling. Note, however, the recourse to the term experience. This definition only makes sense if we are experiencing human beings and understand what experience is. Both conditions are necessary, because our form of consciousness is a self-conscious form of consciousness, which in turn implies that our experiences are related to a self that can take these experiences as objects and reflect upon them in judgments such as promises ought to be kept. This idea of experience also includes the ideas of both doing and undergoing, as suggested by Dewey in his work, Art as Experience. There is much in the language games used by chat robots that appears to make sense, but on closer conceptual examination falls apart. Weizenbaum's trust in the idea of a contract is perhaps a consequence of his belief in what he calls science, which, whilst not reducible to the kind of calculation he despises, is nevertheless an anti-rational position. He says, amongst other things, for the only certain knowledge science can give us is knowledge of the behavior of formal systems, that is, systems that are games invented by man himself, and in which to assert truth is nothing more or less than to assert that, as in a chess game, a particular board position was arrived at by a sequence of legal moves. Page 14. Aristotle believed that all men are mortal is a theoretical knowledge statement which we are absolutely certain of, not because of a relation to primitive elements of a formal system, but because we are rational animals capable of discourse. The kind of understanding we have, in this case, could never be purely observational, because observation is of particulars situated in a space-time matter continuum, and being situated in a time span and being alive at that particular time could never constitute immortality. Conceptual truths such as all men are mortal are, then, true not in virtue of being related to any particular, but rather only in virtue of being related to a class of particulars that are categorized by the understanding. The author continues. All empirical science is an elaborate structure built on piles that are anchored not on bedrock, as supposed, but on the shifting sand of fallible human judgment, conjecture, and intuition. The man in the street surely believes such scientific facts to be well established, as well proven, as his own existence. His certitude is an illusion, nor is the scientist himself immune to the same illusion. In his praxis he must, after all, suspend disbelief in order to do or think anything at all. He is rather like a theatre-goer, who, in order to participate in and understand what is happening on the stage, must for a time pretend to himself that he is witnessing real events. Page 14 to 15.